Okay, today we are going to talk about round 4 of the Cold War. And this is the 70s into the 80s. And so we have a few different readings that we did on this, a few different sources to take a look at here. So we'll start with our first one here. I asked you to find 3 key takeaways from this little outline. So go ahead and take a moment and talk with your partner about that. Which 3 did you pick? Why did you think those were the most important ones? See where you disagree and where you have different ones. Go ahead. Okay, just a couple items that I want to point out on this, that there are times when the East and West are working together. The Soviet Union is borrowing money from the United States and technology. Kissinger, who was the Secretary of State for a long time, called this the theory of interdependence, of making the Soviet Union dependent on us. That was going to help us in the long term. And then agreement for strategic arms limitations talk, agreement to lessen nuclear weapons. So there was times when they were coming together. The idea of Ostpolitik is literally translates into Eastern politics. And so this was West Germany's policy to deal with the East. And then you see that espionage once again rears its head in this situation in the Cold War. The Helsinki Accords, one of our big issues with the Soviet Union was their human rights, the way they treated their people, their citizens, and we were constantly trying to get them to be kinder and gentler. We have another proxy war here in the with the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and then the new hardline approach, Reagan and Thatcher, starting to go at the Soviet Union a little bit more. The idea SDI, or Star Wars as it was more often known as, that we were going to create a laser shield around the United States using satellites. And so if the Soviets shot a ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile, we'd be able to shoot it down with space lasers. And of course, this would make the theory of man irrelevant because it wouldn't be mutually assured destruction. We would be able to save ourselves from destruction with the lasers. But it was ridiculous, redonkulous. Like there was no way that we had the technology. We don't have the technology now, let alone in the 80s. And a lot of people think it was just a way that the United States was trying to spend so much money, force the Soviet Union to spend a ton of money, which ultimately is going to bankrupt them. So the next reading talked a lot about Mitterrand and Thatcher. And so I want you to take a moment with your partner and talk about the 4 key takeaways from this reading. What's important here? Go ahead. Okay, the next reading is about Margaret Thatcher, and there was just a couple questions there for you to answer. It tells you a little bit more about what she did during her reign. It talks about the Falkland Islands. And then you can look at the cartoons too. These are Doonesbury cartoons that just kind of address the ridiculousness of the United Kingdom going to war against Argentina for a tiny former colonial island. But go ahead and take a moment and talk with your partner how you answered those 2 questions about Margaret Thatcher. The next reading talks a lot about Reagan. This is the rekindling of the Cold War. Again, another heat reference, rekindling, the fire starting again and getting hot. Reagan a lot of times is referred to as a cowboy. So I asked you to find the 4 key points in this reading. So go ahead and talk with your partner about that, please. And last but not least, take a look at those 2 political cartoons and tell me, or talk with your partner, what do you think is going on? What is the artist trying to get at? What attitudes is he portraying in both of these cartoons? And the one about the Helsinki Accords, that's specifically what this one is about, and then SALT II, what is the implication there? So go ahead and talk with your partner. Okay, now we're going to get into the lecture for today. This is the Cold War economics in the West, specifically for the 70s and 80s. And so we're kind of taking a run through a couple decades of economic change. And to start with, we have to talk about oil economics. This is when OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, becomes relevant. It's basically a consortium of 14 Middle Eastern, African, and Latin American countries, and they want to control oil production, prices, and all of it. Don't forget, most of these places are former colonies that had been dominated by the West for some time, and now they're trying to assert control over their product. War breaks out between different Arab countries and Israel in 1973. And this causes tension between OPEC and the West because of the United States' support of Israel. So OPEC simply cuts production and prices quadruple of gasoline. So I need you to try to picture if all of a sudden gas is what, like 270 now, and gas doubles and then doubles again over the course of just about a year. And the West and Japan, who had come to rely on cheap oil, they are hit especially hard by this. And this is going to further accelerate inflation, which was started by countries getting off the gold standard, which we talked about in the last economic lecture. But this is just going to cause more and more problems. There wasn't enough gas to go around. Gas was being rationed. And prices were still through the roof. This is a line of gas. You could only go on even and odd days. Some places it depended on your license plate. Some places it depended on your address. So you couldn't even get all the gas you wanted. This is just an idea so you can see what gas prices did, how they went through the roof at this time. And so that, again, this would be like it was doubling and then doubled again. Now, this forced some European countries to develop energy alternatives. Great Britain and Norway started to use oil of their own that they find in the North Sea. The Netherlands develops a natural gas program. France develops nuclear energy. They're still one of the world leaders in nuclear energy. The U.S. Doesn't. We don't really do anything as far as energy alternative, and yeah, that's why we're still beholden to these gas prices. So yeah, we got that going for us. Okay, next we're going to talk about a term that I swear some of you are thinking I'm going to be making this up, but I'm not. It's stagflation. This is a stagnant economy combined with inflation. Stagflation. Basically, we're going to see a global recession that's growing through 1974, and we're kind of leading up to it with inflation. Once every place gets off the gold standard, the United States is one of the last in 72, and so there's just going to be more and more with that combined with the oil crisis. Basically, the economic growth, which has basically been going on unhindered in the West since the end of World War II, is going to stop. It's the first real downturn since the end of World War II. This is a lot of people point to this as the Bretton Woods Agreement kind of falling apart. That agreement in the post-war economic world, like it's kind of coming undone. We're seeing unemployment up in the West to about 10%, which is pretty substantial. But basically what we're seeing is workers are saved the worst tragedies of the 1930s because of the creation of, the welfare state. Very good. And so there's unemployment benefits, there's Social Security, there's safety nets in place to help these workers out. But one of the things that we're going to see is that structural unemployment is going to remain a major problem and isn't going to go away. Structural unemployment means that technology is replacing manpower. This is robotics, this is computers, this is an issue that's still today. And if we want to do some synthesis here, some complex understanding, who can we connect this to? Another time when technology replaced labor and people got upset about it. The Industrial Revolution, weavers, the Luddites, if you remember them. That was an early example of structural unemployment, and that does not change. Now, as your readings talked about, the readings that we just went over, there's also growing down in Keynesian economics. There's a whole emergence of politicians who don't think that Keynesian economics is necessarily the best way to approach things. The conservatives in Britain is Margaret Thatcher, first female prime minister, conservative American president, Ronald Reagan. They both attack the welfare state. They call it wasteful, and they want to limit government spending. They believe in what's called supply side economics. That if they give tax cuts for businesses and the wealthy, that they're going to increase production, and in turn, the benefits would trickle down, benefiting all. It's also called trickle down economics, especially by those opposed to it. Just so you know, this is basically the end of the post-war consensus in Great Britain. We talked about for a long time that the Conservatives and the Labour parties, were pretty much lockstep in what they wanted and how they wanted it. Now we're seeing that break apart. So take a moment and talk with your partner about this political cartoon, what the artist is getting at here. This is Britain. This social programs for the non-wealthy is what it says on his shirt. So take a moment and talk about that political cartoon. Have at it. Okay, we are going to see a recovery in the global economy from about 1982 on, give or take, in different places at different levels at different times. But basically the global economy starts going up, the Western economy, I should say, starts going up from about 1982 on. And now this reinforced faith in the free market economy as opposed to the planned economy. So people are like, well, we struggled, but look, we bounced back. And people believe that the market is the key to growth, but the government still should be responsible for people's welfare. The government must be responsible for people's welfare. And so the idea is that the welfare state still served an important social need, even if there should be less government intervention in some aspects of the economy, which is still the argument that Western countries have today. As part of this recovery, we get this idea of mutual interdependence. And people are believing that prosperity in a free market economy depended on global free trade, depended on all these countries working together to keep goods and services and people moving around. So prosperity in a free market economy depended on global free trade. And so they form an organization, and there's 7 countries in it. So they very cleverly titled it the Group of 7. And then later when they had Russia, after the end of the Cold War, they call it the Group of 8. It goes by the G8. But then after Russia invaded Ukraine, they kick them out because they're jerks. So now they're the G7 again. But anyway, so it's US, Great Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Is all who's on that list. And they basically have annual meetings to consult on the state of the global economy and to make sure that they're working together well. So that is all the economic news for here. Now we're going to talk about enlargement of the European community. We're going to see a set of countries add in here. In 73, Great Britain finally gets in, although on a limited scale. We'll talk about them. They're kind of always the exception that proves the rule. And Denmark and Ireland, Greece in 86, Greece in 81, Spain and Portugal, Austria, Finland, Sweden. We won't talk about them right now. They kind of come in later. But there was a lot of people who actually feared, because of the stagflation, that countries wouldn't want to join this European Union anymore. But in fact, everybody keeps wanting to join. Sorry, I should be calling this the European Economic Community, because it's not the EU yet. It's still the EEC. And so people are continuing to want to join. But as we're getting more and more countries, there's going to be social, cultural stressors over new members. Basically, you're letting in some countries that are a little poor, some countries that are very different, Spain and Portugal, Ireland. And so what is this going to do? For a long time, it was just a Western European club. And now we're expanding, And what is this going to do to membership? What does it mean for this club? Now, Great Britain has some issues with this also. They are the largest importer. They import the most from the European community. So they paid a lot of money into what they call the community fund, basically like a kitty. The more you import, the more you kick into this. But the idea is that if you kick in, you're going to get stuff out. But you get more out if you grow food, if it emphasizes agricultural contributions. And so Great Britain, that doesn't really grow any food anymore, they are kicking a lot of money in and not getting a lot out. So they're annoyed with this. So first in 80 and then again in 84, Thatcher negotiates lower contributions to the community fund. Uh, so again, it's a lot of detail, but what's important to know is basically England's a little bit different. They're not quite in the club the same way as everybody else is. They have slightly different rules from which they wanted. They negotiated. They're in, but they're just a little bit different. Um, and then even by the mid to late 70s, any desire for political integration is disappearing fast. People are focusing solely on economic integration with this EU and this EEC. Uh, and there's really no desire. The European Parliament is just symbolic. It's basically like a thing where rich people can send their kids to get it like an internship and whatnot. All right. So let's create the EU now. Let's create the European Union. By the time we get into the 70s and 80s, Europe is falling behind. Basically, we have this what some people call the third industrial revolution, which is about automation and computers. And Europe is just falling behind. One of the big reasons is because they have so many labor protections in place that they can't fire people they can't automate jobs. And replace people, which is great for those people's jobs, but is ultimately bad, and they're just becoming less competitive. And Europe wants to catch up. They want to catch up the way the US and Japan are just absolutely dominating the global scene. Another reason Europe is falling behind is because the way the rules of the EEC are set up, it basically encourages overproduction of agricultural goods. There's no reason to control these goods because the prices are going to be guaranteed. And this hurts small farmers because they're just pushed out of business. There's a lot of jokes about wine lake and butter mountains, and just because there's so much excess, which ultimately is going to hurt the small farmers. This emphasis of the EU, by the way, of the EEC on agriculture, shows the dominance of agricultural areas like France, which is really one of the last agricultural heartlands in all of Europe. So it shows how they just are disproportionately kind of dominating this institution. A third reason or a third example we can point to Europe falling behind is something we call Euro-pessimism. Basically, it's just these pessimistic feelings about the present and the future. It goes from really 75 to 86. It kind of peaks in 84 and then things start getting better. But there's just a feeling that like our best times are past us. This is Europe feeling this way. And maybe we're just never destined to do great things again. And we tried after the war, but things are just down. But we're going to see when the EEC starts to recover, Europe actually gets kind of a second wind, if you will, a new feeling of optimism. And then they start to realize that their best hope for the future is in further integration. Like, let's keep going with this movement and let's keep getting closer and closer together. And so in 1987, they signed the Single European Act. And this is going to remove all barriers that impede freedom of movement. So this is going to be a total free trade zone. All physical, technical, administrative, and legal barriers. They're trying to create like there are no borders. Again, just for business, for finance, but like no borders at all. Common productive standards, uniform tax rates, recognize each other's licensing. All to promote the movement of people, goods, services, and capital. There's even plans for currency integration, of creating a common currency. And this is a big issue because you think about these legendary currencies and you've got the pound and the franc and the lira and the Deutschmark. Well, that's a new one because they just did a new currency after World War II. But the kroner and all of these, just legendary currencies. And they're talking about getting rid of them for one common currency. Now, it's not going to happen just yet. But this is a very big deal. And the treaty that creates the European Union is known as the Maastricht Treaty. And it only happened after some serious protracted debates, and it was very, very close. There's referendums, there's countries demanding exceptions. The referendums are very close every bit of the way. Some countries it kind of gets backed into illegally, and they just kind of get it by going through back channels. So just kind of read that little blurb there, and you'll see just how close it was to a European Union not being created, which I think is interesting for our conversation, because when people talk about the EU now and the disintegration of the EU and Brexit and all this, I think it's important to remember that it's a pretty recent creation. It wasn't a universally popular creation when it was made. And even then, England was kind of on the outside. They were just kind of tangentially and just kind of dipping their toes in the water in. That's not to say that there's not a lot of people who have become very attached to it. But I think we start talking about institutions as if they've been around forever, when in reality they are pretty young, especially in the light of all of European history and the separateness that has been traditionally the norm. So anyway, hopefully you got an idea of the economy in the 70s and 80s. And tomorrow we will have our media day. You have a reading now to do that you can start with. And thank you for your attention, and we'll see you guys next time.